Bartoli. I am the Dean of the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and I want to welcome all of you here. It's a pleasure and a privilege to serve in a role like this at this time. The school is getting stronger by the day, and the liveliness of the experience is tempered by the desire to keep it together, to keep it as a coherent whole that doesn't constrain anybody into preconceived structures, but rather supports the liberating inquiries of many into the difficult challenge of conflict. As part of my role, I need to introduce some of the friends that are here, and I want to start with the advisory board. So I would like to ask all the members of the advisory board to stand and be recognized. We have a wonderful board, and we are definitely delighted that this board is supporting us in so many ways. We are also delighted to have Molly and Bill here. I'm not allowed to say their last name. I was bound to a sort of a friendly acknowledgement that I will do something informal. So I'm not mentioning that, but I just want to acknowledge that I'm very happy to have them both here. There is something about knowing somebody the first time that is very good. And there is something even better when you know this somebody the second time, or the third time, or the fifth time. There is something very good about meeting people over and over again. And I think that it's good for us to be here tonight for a lecture that is making possible for us to be who we are. So let me elaborate for 30 seconds just on that idea. How is it possible that a lecture makes us something? Well, the first observation is that in many ways we are the words we say, and that we need to take those words very seriously. We are also the words we hear, we listen, we cherish, we welcome. And that so many of you being here tonight is a demonstration that many of you would like to hear from a distinguished speaker about a certain topic at a certain time. And that there is something about nourishing ourselves with words the same way we nourish ourselves with food. We get our energy for our bodies from the food we get, but we definitely get the energy for our mind and our soul from the words that we receive, that we cherish, that we keep. And so I feel that in many ways, I would like to welcome all of you tonight in a spirit of gratefulness, grateful to all those who made scar and the Lynch lecture possible, because I think that contribution to the field at large and the potential are just incredible. To give you a sense of the depth of this involvement, I would like you to travel with me for a moment from, for those who know the place, point of view as a space to point of view as a web of relationship. From the Lynch lecture as a moment to the Lynch lecture as an opportunity, a case, a word that is shared among us. I think that we definitely see how the occasion of the lecture is bringing us together. We are not that together very often. This is actually a very specific thing that happens only once a year. And it's a good thing for the community to be together. There was a great buzz outside. Everybody was speaking, everybody was meeting, everybody was saying something. And I will definitely give the floor to Professor Charlene soon to introduce the speaker tonight. My role is here just to set the tone and to welcome all of us. And I would like to stress that I resonate with what Mark Goodell said after one Lynch lecture in the past, when he said, this is when we come together. Everything comes together. I felt that observation was astute, because indeed, if we come together in words, the recognition of the words shared together make the community a community of inquiry, a community of concern, especially as Kevin Avrock mentioned recently at the faculty board, what we share is actually a problem, a concern about a problem, a concern of a problem called conflict that we all share. So it is with great pleasure that I'm inviting you to welcome these words that will be given tonight, the speaker that will give them, but also the tradition in which these words are in a way located. The same way we welcome something that we do not know, we cannot control, is this invitation opening ourselves not only to the gratitude of what happened in the past, but what may happen next. So I was using this double image of point of view and the Lynch lecture. And I must say that I was very proud when I discovered from Professor Alan Nand that the co-facilitator of the South Ossetian Georgian process is now a minister, I believe, sworn in today. Tomorrow. So what is point of view? A place where you make ministers? Or a human web in which ideas, words, make possibilities credible, meaningful, relevant to others that may or may not have considered him a valuable candidate? What I found curious is that the appointment of that particular minister is changing Professor Nan, is changing point of view, is changing Esker. And so I'm ready to be changed by Professor Vivienne Jabri tonight. I'm ready to be changed by Professor Chadley's introduction of Professor Vivienne Jabri. I'm happy to be changed by all of you in this infinite iteration of the words that we share. I just want to stress how important, as the Dean, this moment is for us. Indeed, it is good to be together for the Lynch lecture once a year for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, and welcome, folks. This is lovely that you're here, and it's a testimony to how much we are looking forward to your comments this evening. Most of you know who I am. I'm Sandra Sheldon. I'm the Vernon and Minnie Lynch Professor, and in that role, over the past several years, I have had the pleasure of organizing our annual lecture series. The lecture series has been going on for almost 25 years. This is the 24th annual Lynch lecture today. So in the tradition of what Andrea talked about, I'm going to actually talk a little bit about the lecture series and why we think you're here and why this is such an important event. It's a series actually in honor as a payback to an absolutely wonderful and now extended family. It's been kind to our school over the years. They've funded my endowed chair. Multiple people have been in this endowed chair as we rotate them around. They've given us this stunning piece of property called Point of View that Andrea just mentioned. That was their name, and now it's our name for that piece of property on Mason Neck. They believed in our mission. They believed in thinking that we could find a way to make this a more peaceful world. They really believed that. Isn't that like precious nowadays? And they had a vision, and their vision was to help us to continue broaden our knowledge about conflict theory, conflict research, and conflict practice within our school, with our faculty and our students in this community right now, in the university community at large, and in the field at large. The Lynch lecture series was our small gift to give back to the Lynch family to say thank you. It's had an array of very interesting thinkers over the years, and I'd like to identify just a few of them that at least I've been a party to. So a childhood friend of our friend and faculty colleague Carlos Slutsky Carlos was part of his Argentinian clan, Luis Marino Ocampo. You may recognize his name. He was the first, and most recently the first retired, chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. We had a fascinating evening considering the issues involved with the ICC, all the lessons informed from the field and challenges in terms of how we think about human rights and social justice. Andrew Mack, the next year, the director of Human Security Report Project, dazzle us with more research and more research data that we could adequately take in one evening, and engage us in a very lively discussion about the impact of organizations such as the UN regarding conflict intervention and prevention. U.S. House Representative for nearly 4 decades, Lee Hamilton, Vice Chair of the 9/11 Commission and President of the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, spoke to us about post-9/11 issues in particular, and what do we do when we framed others as unacceptable. Another giant in the field, this time with a focus on diplomacy, was the Honorable Ambassador Jan Eliasson, the U.S. Ambassador from Sweden and the President of the 60th session of the UN General Assembly, and then the Special Envoy Representative to Darfur. He challenged us to consider essential agenda and alliance for the U.S. and Europe, using only a small amount of its resources, let's say 100 billion, to bring clean water to every human being on Earth, to end world literacy by developing literacy education for girls, to take on organized crime syndicates and illegal activities, sex, drug trafficking, and through research solve global health problems, tropical diseases, as well as our own diabetes and obesity and heart disease. And he said to have an essential transatlantic alliance in conflict zones with policies on peacekeeping. 2 years ago, we were honored with our own Andrea Bartoli, our dean. Though he could easily have informed us of his extraordinary work, internationally renowned work in genocide prevention, he spoke instead about practice, about traditioning innovation, challenging us to make innovation our way of doing business, not to be complacent with old practices. His work with dynamical systems and conflict offered an alternative model for thinking about conflict escalation. When he thinks about the escalation of conflict, it's usually an uphill frame. He flipped it. The model allows us to think about falling into conflict, getting into the gully of it, and what do we do with that? Last year was an interesting experiment. The summer of 2011, a small delegation from SCAR went to China and met Madame Yen Junji. Madame Yen is the vice chair of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress of China and the chair of the China Association for Promoting Democracy. It was in her capacity, too, as the chair of the China's People Association for Peace and Disarmament, called CPAPD. Took me a while to learn that one. We thought she would be an extraordinarily provocative person on how does a country like China think about peace and conflict resolution. Well, we certainly learned about the complexity and the enormous difficulty of a China in transition and how to cope with the issues of transparency and public dialogue regarding these kinds of protected paradigms. So, in the keeping with our provocative charge, we're delighted this year to welcome Vivienne Jabri. Let me tell you about her background, and then I'll get out of the way so you'll have time to listen to her remarks and we'll have a time to have a discussion with her. Following her lecture, you'll notice there are some chairs up here. We've asked three students and another faculty member to join in opening a discussion with Vivienne. We will then open up the microphones to the audience at large. Vivienne Jabri is a professor of international politics. Well, actually, she's one of us, you know, a part of our community, the middle of the sandwich of 3 generations. When she was doing her master's program at King's College with folks like John Burton, she attended a guest lecture from a fella from City College. His name was Christopher Mitchell. She said, I knew he was the one I wanted to do my work with. And so she did her doctorate at City College, and he was her chair of her dissertation. Now, didn't we all have that experience when we first met Chris Mitchell? I'm going to work with that guy. She completed her doctoral program at City, and Chris was her chair, and then she took her turn. She was the chair of our own Peter Mandeville, who's the director of the Center for Global Studies and most recently co-director of the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies. Small world, isn't it? So anyway, as I was saying, Dr. Jabri is the professor of international politics and coordinator of the Center for the Study of Political Community in the Department of War Studies at King's College in London. Prior to joining that faculty, in 2003, she had lectured at St. Andrews and the University of Kent. Her speech this evening, Human Rights, Sovereign Rights, and the Potential for Conflict Resolution, is likely to be informed by her own research on critical and post-structural social and political theory, to investigate the intersections of international politics, conflict, war, and security practices. Dr. Jabri has conducted collaborative research on the implications of the nexus of these for liberties and human rights. She's a prolific scholar, widely published, 6 books, many chapters, lots of journal articles. Many of you in the room right now are reading her work this semester. Her latest book is the post-colonial subject, Claiming Politics Governing Others in Late Modernity. Some titles of her chapters and articles gives us a sense of her passion and her scope. Cosmopolitan Politics, Security, Political Subjectivity. Transformation of War, Perspectives from International Political Sociology. Security, Multiculturalism, and Cosmopolis. Michael Foucault's Analytics of War, the Social, the International, and the Racial. And Shock and Awe, Power and the Resistance of Art. So please, please, join me with a warm welcome for Vivienne Jabri.
Okay, thank you very much for a most generous welcome and very generous words from everybody. It's really great to be here because, as Sandy says, I do have a long association with George Mason, even though this is actually my first visit to the university, and especially to SCAR. I think you're in a wonderful place. The research that goes on here is really very important in the field of conflict and peace research, and I would say for international politics, actually. So I'm very much looking forward to our interactions this evening. And what I want to do is to try not to be so theoretical this evening, but nevertheless you'll see that the theory and the conceptualizations that I work with are very much there in the journey that I'm going to take you through. Now, what is that journey? As you know, and as you've seen from the publicity for this lecture, the title is Human Rights, Sovereign Rights, and the Potentials of Conflict Resolution. In a sense, I see a challenge that's being presented to us now in the 21st century. And that challenge is that there are indeed, and we are witnessing, the extremes of violence going on across the world. And so the challenge is how do we respond intellectually as well as, if you like, praxeologically? How do we respond? And so the journey I want to take you through, in a sense, starts from Syria, present-day Syria. I'll not say much about what is going on. We all know what's going on. We're all witnessing what is going on there. So the journey takes us from Syria, or at least it starts from Syria, and ends in a little place called Sant'Egidio, which is just outside of Rome. However, that journey takes us via a rather complex route, and I'm hesitant to tell you what this complex route is, but I'm afraid you're going to have to sit there and listen to, to this complex route, because it's very important and it's at the heart of what I'm going to say. The route takes us via Immanuel Kant, it takes us via Jürgen Habermas, and finally it takes us via Michel Foucault. Because these 3 characters, and I apologize to my feminist sisters for the fact that there aren't many men mentioned here, but as you'll see at the end of my talk, a very valiant and important woman comes through in the conceptualization and theorization that I'm providing here, namely Hannah Arendt. Because Arendt is most significant here, as you'll see. So that's the journey that I'll be talking you through. Now, I can't remember how long I've been given, because I can, my students say I do have this tendency to go on, and I sort of have this tendency to forget that they might have questions and so on. So I'd better time myself, and I'm assuming I have 40 minutes. Excellent. So I'll try and confine my comments to 40 minutes. Even though it is, I think it's 1 o'clock or even 2 o'clock now, a.m., my time, right? So you must excuse me if I sound hoarse or anything like that, or if I lose the track in this journey. So from Syria to Santa Egidio via Kant, Habermas, and Michel Foucault, and then ending up with Hannah Arendt, as I say. What does Kant teach us? What does he provide us? He provides us with, in a sense, the very beginnings of what we might call today critical theory. He teaches us that, indeed, he was probably the first critical theorist, because he argued that human beings have this capacity to self-legislate, to be self-reflexive, to think about their environment and to think about what they say. So it was in that sense that Michel Foucault pays tribute in his What is Enlightenment to Michel Foucault as being the first critical theorist. And so we're here today exactly to reflect on what we have to say about conflict and conflict resolution. But Kant teaches us something else much more important in my view. He had a cosmopolitan imaginary, and that's very important. He was very concerned with the idea of the human as being a rights bearer. The human being as rights bearer for Immanuel Kant suggested that the human self is also, or can be also, a suffering self. In other words, much harm can be done to the human being, and we know that to be the case. So he was concerned with human rights, and it was his cosmopolitan imaginary that enabled him to think about the distant other. And he talked about hospitality to the other as being a manifestation of his cosmopolitan imaginary. However, he also questioned himself exactly in relation to this imaginary. In other words, the question that he asked himself was, what is it to have a political system or an international system that is indeed based on this cosmopolitan imaginary? And he argued against a cosmopolitan formation of the international. For Immanuel Kant, this was the paradox. To recognize the rights of the individual self, in a sense, presented the opportunity to transform relationships internationally. However, he argued against the redefinition of what was an imaginary, the cosmopolitan imaginary, into something much more, into something positive, namely cosmopolitan law. For Immanuel Kant, law is the great pacifier. Law pacifies the internal community of the liberal Republican modern secular state. However, to convert a cosmopolitanism of rights into a legal system meant for Immanuel Kant the transformation of the international into empire. So here we have exactly that original critical thinker reflecting on his own imaginary and the political implications of his own imaginary. So the paradox for Immanuel Kant is that indeed he recognizes the human self as rights bearer, However, he limits the potentials of cosmopolitanism. He puts the brakes on what cosmopolitanism can do. And he wishes to retain the notion of the sovereignty of the state. But this was a paradox for Kant, because the primary, if you like, element in his philosophy is exactly that autonomous being. Right? And this hails through from the dawn of modernity to the present, the Enlightenment idea of the individual self as being capable of self-reflection, being capable of reflection upon their cultural and phenomenal context. But as I say, Kant absolutely reiterates the limits that should be placed exactly on the ambitions, if you like, of the cosmopolitan imaginary. Because ultimately, the ambitions of the cosmopolitan imaginary is to extend that law, and specifically the force of law, internationally. So Kant presents us with this paradox. And so in this journey comes Jürgen Habermas. And when he writes about developing this Kantian perspective, he talks about revising Immanuel Kant, as he puts it, 200 years later. The thing for Habermas, the challenge for Habermas and for the rest of us, is that we do live in a globalized world. The conflicts we see are transnational conflicts. Conflict in late modernity is no respecter of state boundaries. So what do state boundaries mean in this late modern context? So for Habermas, the Kantian cosmopolitan imaginary has to be given positive force. In other words, if we look to the two elements of rights that I'm talking about, human rights, sovereign rights, Habermas argues that the latter, sovereign rights, have to be trumped by human rights. And I don't think any of us in this room would disagree with that. I don't think we would. Hands up, whoever disagrees with that statement. You know, we would not disagree with him on this one. So how do we challenge Habermas in his formulation? What is he saying? What perspective on peace is Habermas providing that Immanuel Kant does not provide and does not help us with? Remember that Immanuel Kant, in his pamphlet, some would say rather angry pamphlet, because he wrote it actually to show up the Prussian king and his warlike regime. For Immanuel Kant, we could indeed have a sort of perpetual peace. And the internal constitution of the state is very important for Immanuel Kant, right? I'll come back and critique Kant as well. Kant does not get away with it that easily, you see. But for Habermas, the notion of perpetual peace is only possible by coming up and designing a cosmopolitan arrangement. And what he wants to see is exactly the pacification of the sovereign state. The pacification, and as he puts it, the domestication of the international. The international arena is an anarchical context. But it is, in late modernity, increasingly subject to all sorts of regulations, right? Globalization as a process is not some mad, chaotic process going on out there. There's actually a lot of regulation. But what Habermas wants to see is exactly the pacification of sovereignty as such. In other words, political sovereignty, that juridical political sovereignty of the state. He wants human rights to trump the sovereignty of the state. And so if you ask Habermas, how does he help out in relation to conflict, and especially violent conflict? For Habermas, peace is the equivalent of a respect for human rights. That's his definition of peace. So, peace as pacification, peace as the taming of sovereignty, and ultimately, this taming and this pacification in the service of the rights of the individual human self. But what are the implications? And you know what? Habermas is not the only person. He's in a huge company of people. I'll mention two of these. Kofi Annan. Before Kofi Annan, Boutros Ghali, UN Secretary General. During the 90s and into the 2000s, both of these people were arguing exactly for that taming of the sovereign state. Because across the world, the most extreme of violence is perpetrated against populations by their very own regimes. Right? Or by the factions of those regimes. So we have to have a response in a sense. So Kofi Annan and Boutros Ghali were exactly making the same argument. Let us trump state sovereignty in the name of human rights. And once again, they have a conception of peace that's actually very Habermasian. In other words, the idea of peace as being the equivalent of human rights and the positive force of human rights. So peace building, in a sense, takes over, begins to take over from diplomacy and conflict resolution, right? Now, the alarm bells need to start going right now in all our heads, okay? Because in this room, we're interested in conflict resolution. And there's a good reason for that, right? So peace building comes to take over all sorts of interventionist practices involving the UN, involving non-governmental organizations, involving individuals, and so on and so on. A kind of international civil service at large, in and out of countries, peace building, state building, institution building, governing. Right? So there's a backdrop to this, the emergence of peace building as an alternative to conflict resolution. And it has been an alternative. And conflict resolution, in the meantime, has been undermined. And there are reasons for that. So for Habermas, cosmopolitan law, actually we're seeing manifestations of cosmopolitan law. We now have an international criminal court. And we've seen people like, well, Mladic is up in front of the criminal court. I'd like to see many people in front of that court. Shall I name some? I'd like to see Blair in front of that court. I haven't even mentioned a former president of this country. So, in the Habermasian context, you know, his dream of a cosmopolitan law is indeed coming to fruition gradually. Because gradually, things that people do out there in other people's countries can come back to haunt them in the future. Milosevic, Mladic, Karadzic, all of these guys, Charles Taylor, the people who perpetrated the Rwanda genocide, and so on and so on, right? So there is a process of transformation going on juridically in the international arena, and this is transforming the international into a kind of cosmopolitan space. But it's not a cosmopolitan space in the sense of cosmopolitanism as conviviality, as the recognition of difference and diversity. Rather, it's very much a juridical understanding of cosmopolitanism, and this makes a difference. Because it's underpinned by what Jacques Derrida would call the force of law. And so let's start our critique of Habermas. His heart is in the right place, by the way. And one year, many years ago, my students went to one of his lectures and went up to him and said, "Can we have a photo with you? You're always mentioned by our professor." So he's a very nice man, and he was generous in that context. So his heart's in the right place. In Habermas, law indeed becomes the third force, the great pacifier of nations. So from the Kantian imaginary, we've now moved in this journey to the force of law. What are we talking about when we talk about the force of law? We're talking about violence as being constitutive of that law. For someone like Walter Benjamin, and I'm sure you've all come across Walter Benjamin, for someone like Walter Benjamin, and his spectre hovers over us as we talk about cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitan law. For Walter Benjamin, law is indeed constituted by violence. When Habermas supports the intervention in Kosovo, the military intervention in Kosovo, he argues that every military intervention that happens in the name of human rights is one further step in the institutionalization of cosmopolitan law. And so, violence plays a part. Hence, the force of law. Every instance, every instantiation of law, that very first step of law is a violent step. A sovereign has to speak. Every intervention is a decision made. There is always a sovereign who speaks. And in that speaking, the law comes to be constituted as such, including cosmopolitan law. And so, even in Habermas, there is violence at play. So I've brought up the spectre of Walter Benjamin, and now I bring the very real spectre of Michel Foucault. And he's not just spectral, because we engage with him very much in this context. So, what does Michel Foucault do that others don't? He enables us to ask the question, where is sovereign power? Now, in the title of this talk, there is the idea of human rights and sovereign rights. And we might think of this combination in terms of the human individual self as against a sovereign state and its leaders. Let's say the individual Syrian citizen as opposed to Bashar as the sovereign leader of a sovereign independent state. But I think a better way of dealing with this notion of sovereignty is exactly to ask, in our late modern times, where does sovereign power actually lie? And how does it articulate itself? So where lies sovereign power? In other words, who decides? And it's this question of who decides that muddies the waters of the cosmopolitan imaginary. We all want to service the rights of the individual self and of political communities. But we have to, at the same time, in that, using our dialectical imagination, we have to, at the same time, have some awareness of the darker side of that cosmopolitan imaginary. So where lies sovereign power? For Michel Foucault, power is better understood in terms of a triptych. And so he suggests that sovereign power might be understood in terms of the decision about who may live and who may die. It's a very powerful decision. It's often a decision that's publicly enforced. In Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, he tells the story of the public execution. The sovereign has to enact a public execution because he has to have an audience. I use the term he advisedly. He has to have an audience to actually manifest and perform his sovereignty, his sovereign power. And so sovereign power is about that decision, who may live and who may die. But the analysis of power that we find in Michel Foucault doesn't simply stop there. Time passes, liberal societies become more and more sophisticated. And so Michel Foucault writes about disciplinary power, those minute moments of power where the individual self comes to be that element, disciplined, subject to calculation, subject to shaping. Keep this word shaping as a footnote in your head because it's very important in this journey. So disciplinary power seeks to, in a sense, produce a particular kind of person. In Michel Foucault, we, in modern times, from the 18th century right up to the present, we're shaped, we're taught to be, in a sense, free individuals. But because we're subject to pedagogical interventions of that sort, we're not actually free. We are forever subject to surveillance practices. We're forever, through those surveillance practices, subject to a kind of pacification regime that goes on. And so in the Foucauldian perspective, there's no such thing as a sort of internal civic peace, the kind of peace that Immanuel Kant and Jürgen Habermas write about. There is no such thing. He argues that there's a roar of battle going on within society as these practices of pacification and surveillance manifest themselves upon the individual human self. And so he highlights the violence of these practices. But there's a triptych here in Michel Foucault, and he argues that the most sophisticated form of power is biopolitical power. In other words, where populations are the subject of that power. So not the individual, but populations as categories. And so in late modernity, we're living in a biopolitical age. But if we're living in a biopolitical age where wars happen, as Michel Foucault tells us, wars, when they do happen, happen purportedly in the name of humanity at large, in the name of the human, who is the enemy? Who is excluded from that humanity? What are the boundaries of that humanity? If in a globalized context, the boundaries of political community, the boundaries of the state are forever diminished and diminishing, and if indeed we are talking about a transnational arena of human beings moving around, muddying the waters, mucking about, right? Where are the boundaries? Who is outside? Who is the abnormal in this condition, right? So someone decides. Who remains outside of humanity? When a war happens in a biopolitical age, it happens purportedly in the name of the humanity that must be defended. And for Michel Foucault, when such wars happen, they tend to be genocidal wars. They can start with the little massacres here and there, and they end up being genocidal wars. And he mentions the colonial era, he mentions the Holocaust. But that was Foucault's slight move into the international. Foucault spent his life writing about liberal societies, France, Britain especially. All of his work is based on these societies. He ventured out when the Iranian Revolution happened. I have a piece on that. Actually very critical of Michel Foucault in that context. So I wouldn't say much about that. You can ask me about it in the discussion. So Michel Foucault himself does not say much about the international context. It's post-Foucault Foucauldians who do that for him, people like me. So I've seen it as my job to ask myself the question, what would happen if we internationalize Michel Foucault? What would happen, in other words, if we use his analytics of power but apply them internationally? What would we come up with? In this internationalizing of Michel Foucault, we come up with a transformation of sovereign power and the location of political authority. Sovereign power comes to be globally articulated. Remember that public execution happening in some square in the middle of Paris? The story that Michel Foucault tells in Discipline and Punish, that it has to have an audience. Well, that very process is now globally rendered. We're all the audience. The whole world is the audience to the enactment of sovereign power, wherever that sovereign power manifests itself. Then in relation to disciplinary power and biopolitical power, these have come to be manifest exactly in the transformation of our discourses on peace into discourses on peace building. Michel Foucault writes about the genius of liberalism as being self-government. The production, in other words, through all sorts of matrices of power, the production of the liberal subject. We learn our subjectivity, right? We have learnt it in our societies, in our liberal societies. If we transform that idea globally, what we come up with is peace building as the government of other societies. This is where the problems lie. Indeed, this is where our problems actually begin to happen. Right? I've already mentioned actually other problems. I've already mentioned the violence that underpins that initial move, the cosmopolitan imaginary, the Habermasian context, indeed challenge, and why Immanuel Kant was so right to be hesitant, to be actually quite modest with his cosmopolitan imaginary, because Immanuel Kant actually foresaw the dangers that we see today. So peace building becomes the government of populations. And guess what? It's other people's populations. Populations located in other countries. So what the societies that Michel Foucault engages with went throughout the trajectory of modernity, now we want to impose on them. Who decides? Who is the sovereign in this context? Michel Foucault writes about biopolitical war as being possible because of the racial division of populations. The examples, as I said before, the examples that he provides are colonial wars as well as the Holocaust. Now in the present, those boundaries I talked about, the boundaries of states, the boundaries of political community, within the globalized context, these boundaries are being diminished. We can see that. But they become manifest once again, corporeally in the very bodies of the other targeted. So the borders of populations come to be racially manifest. Other people's cultures are increasingly racialized. So, from peace to peace building and the government of populations, peace building seeks to reshape and redesign other populations, and in so doing, undermine processes of actual recognition, actual conflict resolution. So in the last few minutes, I want to come back to this potential that conflict resolution might have. I want to, in a sense, reclaim a space in our thinking, reclaim that conflict resolutionary spirit, if you like, as well as that intellectual context. So what are the choices for conflict resolution then? One choice we have is to just seek to govern, to redesign other societies. So what's happened in Syria is this notion of being able to govern the very process of transformation that's taking place there, to govern the imaginary of the revolutionaries in that country. The West has started arming the rebels with a view to potentially, maybe in the future, or even now, governing that revolutionary process, to shape its directionality, in other words. Right? That's one choice. And by the way, it's already been made, that choice. The other choice is politics. The first choice I've just been going through, Michel Foucault would label government, the government of populations, the shaping and redesigning of populations to make them amenable, if you like. But the other choice is politics. And the journey now takes us to Sant'Egidio. That first choice, government, is informed by colonial rationality. It has to be. It's this idea that we can shape and redesign other societies. The second choice, politics, in a sense, takes us to a post-colonial rationality. Not a cosmopolitanism of intervention, but a cosmopolitanism of recognition, of politics and of choices relating to solidarity. Whose side do we take? If you recognize that there are actually many sides in this revolutionary process that's going on in the Middle East, if you recognize that there are many sides, the challenge, in a sense, is to provide for the recognition of all sides, but at the same time, to reflect on the consequences of certain choices made. It's a tough choice. Life's business being the terrible choice, as a certain Robert Burns put it. That's the dilemma. That's the paradox. And so, what happened at Sant'Egidio? Not so long ago, a group of opposition spokespeople, women and men, were invited to Sant'Egidio, and the dean, Andrea, is involved with that community. And these opposition groupings, the non-violent ones, put out a statement. What did that statement say? What was significant about that statement? It was that there is diversity. They do want respect for human rights and democracy. But they were opposed to a violent expression of that, of their struggle. They were also opposed to intervention in Syria because they valued the post-colonial sovereignty of the Syrian state. These are post-colonial populations. They're constituted by memories of the colonial era. They know a colonial rationality when it faces them like this, close up and personal, some would say, or you guys might say, right? So we have a choice here between two rationalities. A colonial one that imagines the liberal self extending ever outwards, seeing the world as their oyster, committing not just epistemic violence, to quote Gayatri Spivak, but also actual physical violence, a violence directed at populations. Caring to kill is another way of putting this. This idea of the liberal self being able to govern other societies and determine and shape their futures. This is a cosmopolitan imaginary. That's actually a manifestation of that other kind of sovereign power, the power to decide who may live and who may die. But the choice for conflict resolution is the political choice. It's being able to provide for that voice that speaks up post-colonially in that and in this post-colonial context, where the anti-colonial struggles of the past are very much in the memories of those target populations. They might have celebrated Blair's arrival in Kosovo. The people of Iraq did not celebrate Blair's arrival in Basra or Baghdad, right? So the choice is there, and that's why I want to come back to the problematic of Syria, because it's in a sense imperative upon us to reflect on what's going on out there, but to give it force by acknowledging that we're not the first to think about these issues, that actually we have these powerful antecedents. So lastly, and by no means finally, I want to bring in Hannah Arendt. For Hannah Arendt, it's the political that matters. But what understanding of the political does she bring to our discourses here? For Arendt, politics means the insertion of presence, the insertion of self into that public arena, thereby constituting that arena. Arendt was very much an admirer of the founding fathers of this country, very much an admirer of the American Revolution. And she's very controversial in her writings. Everything she wrote has been subject to much controversy, and deservedly so, right? Any great philosopher has to be so subject to controversy and debate and discourse. For Arendt, politics was not about basic human needs. It was about that claim to politics, the idea that we actually have a voice, and indeed can have a voice. So the political for Hannah Arendt is that moment of insertion into the public arena, that claim made to politics. But the claim can easily be captured by the forces that seek to govern. She knew that. She recognized that danger. The Arab Spring that we've all witnessed when it started and when it was happening, especially when we were watching the Egyptians on the streets at Tahrir Square, these were joyous events for all of us. My students were involved, they were going out there and so on. So the cosmopolitan imaginary was being played out exactly by those moments of solidarity, the expression of solidarity by my students, extended to the students who were out there endangering their lives on Tahrir Square. In an Arendtian sense, that was the moment of politics. That was the revolutionary moment. In the Arendtian sense, the aspiration was to then move to the second step. It's not enough just to be out there in revolt. The second step was constitution building. In other words, the building of a political community that enabled politics to take place. But that moment somehow has evaded the revolutionaries. In my opinion, what's happened is that we're back into that space of governmentality, the expression of power, working its way in the idea, through the idea, that we can even shape other people's revolutions. That's what happened in Libya, and this is what's happening right now as we speak in Syria. So the moment of joy is now not so joyous after all. This is not a pessimistic ending. I have been accused of being a pessimist. I'm not a pessimist, but nor am I an optimist. I'm much more of a realist with a small r. A realist with a small r in the Arendtian sense. And Arendt provides much that's to be celebrated. But she writes a cautionary tale. And I hope that what I've said is a cautionary tale. And I think in that tale and in this journey that I've highlighted, that I hope you can see that there is in a sense, there's a need for conflict resolution and even good old-fashioned diplomacy to come back into the frame. Because it's good old-fashioned diplomacy and conflict resolution that provides that moment for recognition, the recognition of the other, and the idea that we cannot shape, ever, other societies. Thank you. Up there?
Up there, right?
Okay, take my watch. You see, I told you I go on for too long.
Well, thank you so much. And now's an opportunity for us to have a discussion with this very provocative presentation. And I'm asked 3 students to come up representing the undergraduate, the master's, and the doctoral program. Undergraduates Alex Pace, I beg your pardon. Master students Della Fruz, Konika Boiva. I apologize if I butchered that name. And Sarah Fetterman is our PhD student, and Rich Rubenstein is our professor. And I want to, at this moment, acknowledge an appreciation to Rich for making the linkage to be sure that we got Vivienne Jabri today. So they are going to start with some questions. And then when I come back up to the mic, that's a signal to our group that we want to open it up for open mics to the group. Yeah. Any place. Mm-hmm.